Honourable Senators, I wish to begin by recognizing that we are on unceded Algonquin territory. And secondly, I wish to thank this committee for taking up this urgent matter. Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights is Canada's national sexual and reproductive health and rights organization, and we were one of the stakeholders who raised this issue with the UN Committee Against Torture in November 2018. The following month, Action Canada, along with our colleagues here today and the Native Women's Association of Canada, developed a joint call to action that was signed by nearly 80 civil society and Indigenous organizations and experts in Canada. Many of those recommendations I will reiterate in these remarks. Since that time, we have been concerned with the relative inaction by the federal government on this front, given the magnitude and significance of this issue, which I would call a systematic and significant pattern of human rights violations. Forced and coerced sterilization are violations of sexual and reproductive rights. These are acts of torture and tools of genocide. We have seen them used throughout history and are continuing to learn every day that they disproportionately affect Indigenous, disabled, and otherwise marginalized peoples inside the Canadian health system, for which the federal, provincial, and territorial governments share responsibility. As a party to numerous international human rights treaties, the federal government has a legal duty to end forced and coerced sterilization across all jurisdictions. In contrast to that duty, the consultation that occurred behind closed doors within Indigenous services several months ago did not meet any standards of the government's duty to consult, nor was it transparent in its approach and outcomes. The federal, provincial, territorial working group that has been called has likewise not been transparent to us and has not included many key expert stakeholders to our knowledge. The mandate and agenda for this meeting is unclear, and even before deciding what it must accomplish, this working group must transparently consult with survivors, experts, and other stakeholders. While there is no doubt that systemic racism plays a major role in these violations, it is inappropriate for the Prime Minister and others to infer that this is a problem that will be solved with increased culturally appropriate services for Indigenous peoples. Similarly, even the name of the federal, provincial, territorial working group created to address this issue is called Cultural Competency in Healthcare, which belies the issue. Forced sterilization is not about misunderstanding a person's culture. It is about violating their right to determine for themselves what happens to their bodies. While culturally appropriate services are needed, the health system at every level must take a comprehensive approach to sexual and reproductive rights and ensure that all people know how to define and achieve informed consent from any individual and every individual they encounter. What will it take for Canada to ensure that these human rights violations do not happen again? Or how do we ensure non-repetition as part of achieving accountability? First of all, investigation is needed. We do not yet understand the scope and scale of this current problem in terms of Indigenous survivors of these practices, but also in terms of others who may have been subjected to these practices, such as women with disabilities. And so one of several critical first steps would be to conduct a formal national investigation of forced and coerced sterilization with the purpose of understanding the scope and scale of this harmful practice, as well as ensuring effective reparations to victims. As part of this, the government should appoint a special representative to meet with survivors and their families and to hear their requests for justice and reparations. In considering sanctions for health professionals who have perpetrated forced or coerced sterilization, it is important to apply criminal sanctions for cases where warranted, but also to ensure the full and effective use of other accountability processes, such as professional disciplinary measures and civil remedies, including human rights tribunals, and to support survivors in engaging these processes. A serious consideration that has not yet been addressed in public discourse is that we must ensure that use of criminal sanctions does not have a chill effect on the availability and accessibility of high-quality sexual and reproductive health services based in free and informed consent, particularly for those people often stigmatized and discriminated against by the health sector. Those who are Indigenous or otherwise marginalized are often disproportionately targeted by law enforcement and so are amongst the least likely to seek police protection. And so the problem will not be solved without comprehensive changes within the health system. Lastly, Health Canada, under the leadership of the Minister of Health, must take responsibility for the health system and create a national action plan which needs to squarely tackle this issue to ensure, one, that standards of practice are clarified that as they relate to consent in medical practices, two, that compulsory education is provided to health professionals on these standards and on key issues of racism and other forms of discrimination and stigma. Three, that cultural change within health professions can be achieved. And fourthly, that accountability for these human rights violations can be strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for your presentations. We'll start with our person who has brought us all of this information and convinced us that this is a study that we had to do. And the more we get into it, the more we know that you're absolutely correct. So, Senator Boyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both very much for your presentations and for all of the work that you're doing in this area. It's phenomenal. And I really have enjoyed the recommendations that you have spoke about, Mr. Prasad. And I have a question about, you had suggested that the government put something in place to meet with the survivors and hear their voices. There's one thing that I found in doing the report, that it was absolutely critical that these women were protected, because even by us speaking today and having women listening, it triggers such a horrific emotional response. So I would like you to comment on how that could be accomplished within the framework that you've already laid out for us, keeping in mind that the women's safety is primary.
Absolutely. I think there are many ways of achieving that, and Senator Boyer, let me first begin by thanking you for your leadership on this issue. It's a very important issue, both privacy and confidentiality and safety within any investigation, and I think those would need to be paramount in how that's approached, in terms of how records of those conversations are kept, of interviews with survivors are kept, and how they're approached, and who they have to advocate and support them within that process. And it needs to be voluntary, right? The survivors need to be willing to come forward and speak to any special representative that's appointed to carry out this task of meeting with survivors and their family. So I think that's paramount, is offering that choice and offering different means of ensuring privacy and confidentiality and support during the actual process. That would be critical.
Mm-hmm. So would you suggest that possibly the women who have been affected should be the ones that would be making the decisions on what would be adequate to protect their own safety?
I think that is an excellent step for sure. That is a critical consideration in terms of a human rights approach. You need to center those that are most affected by this issue, and so their needs in that moment and within that process need to be given priority. Absolutely.